Picture this. You're standing inside a cage, not much larger than a closet. The iron bars are cold under your fingers. Outside, hundreds of people have paid to see you. They press their faces against the bars. They laugh. They point. They poke sticks at your body through the gaps. And the man who brought you here, who promised you money, freedom, and a new life, stands to the side collecting coins. You are not an animal. But tonight, in front of this crowd, you might as well be. This was the reality of Sara Baartman, a woman born in South Africa, transported to London like cargo, and turned into the most talked-about spectacle in Europe. For years she was prodded, dissected, humiliated and displayed, first alive, then dead. And the most disturbing part? The people who did this to her believed they were civilized. This is her story, and once you hear it, you will never forget it. In 1789, in the Kamdaboo Valley of what is now the Eastern Cape of South Africa, a baby girl was born into the Khoikhoi people. The Khoikhoi, sometimes called the Khoikhoi, were one of the oldest indigenous groups in southern Africa. For centuries, they had lived as pastoral nomads, moving with their cattle across the vast, golden plains. They had their own language, their own customs, their own way of reading the land and the sky. But by the time Sara was born, their world was already collapsing. European colonizers had arrived. The Dutch had come first, then the British, and with each passing decade, the Khoikhoi lost more of their land, more of their freedom, more of their identity. By the late 18th century, many had been reduced to laborers on colonial farms, working the land that had once been theirs, answering to masters who did not speak their language and did not care to learn it. Sara's parents were among those who had been enslaved on a colonial farm. When Sara was just 2 years old, her mother died. The details are not recorded. No one thought to record them. She was simply gone. And Sara, a toddler in a world that was already brutal and indifferent, was left without the person who would have been her greatest protector. She grew up fast. She had no choice. By the time she reached her teenage years, Sara was described by those who knew her as independent, hard-working, and resourceful. But again, these qualities were not gifts. They were survival mechanisms. The world she lived in gave her no room to be otherwise. Then, when Sara was still a young teenager, tragedy struck again. Her father, a cattle driver, was killed by members of the San people while doing his job. The San, also known as the Bushmen, were the original hunter-gatherers of southern Africa, driven to desperation by the same colonization that had enslaved Sara's parents. They attacked not out of hatred, but out of survival. But Sara didn't know that. She only knew that her father was gone. Within a few short years, she had lost both parents. She had no family, no protection, no safety net of any kind. And then, as if the universe hadn't taken enough from her, Sara married young, as was expected of women in her community. Her husband was a Khoikhoi man who worked as a drummer. For a brief time, there was, perhaps, a sliver of happiness, a sliver of normalcy. Sara became pregnant. She gave birth. And then the baby died. Just like that. 3 losses in the span of a few years. 2 parents, a child, all gone. Whatever innocence Sara had left was gone with them. It was sometime in the early 1800s when a free black trader named Peter Caesars entered Sara Baartman's life. Peter was a man of some means, unusual for a black man in South Africa at the time. He moved through the colonial world with a kind of cautious confidence, trading, networking, looking for opportunities wherever he could find them. When he came across Sara, he saw one such opportunity. He convinced her, or forced her, depending on whose account you believe, to move to Cape Town, which had just come under British control. The city was growing rapidly, a hub of colonial commerce and culture. And Sara, with nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to, went. In Cape Town, Sara worked first as a nursemaid for Peter Caesars, and then as a servant to a Dutch household. It was here that her Dutch masters renamed her Saki, a diminutive form of her name in Dutch. A small act, but a significant one. To strip someone of their name is to strip them of their identity. And her Dutch masters knew exactly what they were doing. Although Sara was not legally enslaved under the laws of the time, her life bore every mark of enslavement. She lived in poor conditions. She had no freedom of movement. She had no choice of employer. She had no recourse if she was mistreated, and she was mistreated. Then came one more blow. A Dutch soldier named Rik van Jong, with whom Sara had developed a relationship, was called away when his regiment left Cape Town. Another person, gone. Another thread of human connection, severed. Sara's life in Cape Town was not a life. It was a series of losses held together by labour. But all of this, every hardship, every humiliation, was about to pale in comparison to what came next. Because one day, a Scottish military surgeon named William Dunlop came to the Caesar's household, and the moment he saw Sara Baartman, something shifted in his eyes. Not attraction, not compassion, something colder, more calculating. He saw money. Sara Baartman had a physical characteristic that set her apart. She had steatopygia, a condition characterized by the significant accumulation of fat around the hips and buttocks, particularly common among Khoikhoi women and considered a sign of health and beauty within her own culture. But William Dunlop was not looking at her through the lens of Khoikhoi culture. He was looking at her through the lens of a European entertainment market that was hungry, ravenous for exotic spectacle. In the early 19th century, Britain was in the grip of a craze for curiosities. Freak shows, natural history exhibitions, and public spectacles drew enormous crowds. People paid to see things that were strange, different, and unfamiliar. And Dunlop, who already made money supplying British showmen with rare animals, recognized immediately that Sara's body would be far more profitable than any exotic animal he had ever traded in. He approached her with a proposition. Come to London. Let people look at you. Make money. Sara refused. She refused once, she refused again. She kept refusing. But Dunlop was not a man who accepted the word no from a Khoikhoi woman with no money, no family, and no legal power. He kept coming back. He kept pushing. He kept painting pictures of wealth and freedom, promises that were calculated, deliberate lies. Eventually, Sara agreed to go, but only under one condition, that Khoikhoi, Peter's brother, in whose household she had been working, came with her. What happened next tells you everything you need to know about the men who controlled Sara's life. Khoikhoi had initially refused to go to England. He was a family man. He was settled. Going abroad was a disruption he didn't want. But then the debts caught up with him. Khoikhoi had borrowed money he couldn't repay. His business was failing. His creditors were circling. And suddenly, the idea of going to London, of making a percentage of whatever money Sara's exhibitions earned, didn't seem so bad after all. So, on the 29th of October 1810, Sara signed a contract. Let's be very clear about what this contract actually was. Sara was illiterate. The document was written in English, a language he did not read or understand. There is no reasonable interpretation under which Sara could have given informed consent to this agreement. And yet, Dunlop and Caesars used this contract as their legal shield for years, pointing to it as proof that Sara had willingly agreed to her own exploitation. The contract stated that Sara would work as a servant and exhibit herself for entertainment purposes. It promised her a portion of the earnings from the show. It promised she could return to South Africa after 5 years. She received none of these things. In the winter of 1810, Sara Baartman boarded a ship to London. She was 21 years old. She had already lost more than most people lose in a lifetime, and she was walking, willingly or not, into something worse than anything she had ever known. Sara arrived in London in November 1810. Dunlop had already prepared everything. There was no settling-in period, no time to adjust to the cold, the noise, the fog of a city unlike anything she had ever seen. Within weeks of arriving, Sara Baartman was on display. The show was held at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly Circus, one of London's most fashionable entertainment venues. The hall was famous for hosting exotic exhibitions, mummies, live animals, curiosities from around the world. And now, Sara Baartman. For the price of 2 shillings, a sum that most working-class Londoners could afford, anyone could come inside and watch her. The setup was simple and brutal. Sara was placed in a cage roughly 1.5 meters wide, barely enough space to take 3 steps in any direction. She was made to walk back and forth, to sing, to perform small tasks, and to simply stand there while the audience pressed close, staring at her body, pointing, whispering, laughing. The flyers advertising the show described her like an animal specimen. Saki is 22 years old, 4 feet 10 inches high, and has a good capacity. She lived as a cook at the Cape of Good Hope. Her country is situated 600 miles from the Cape, where the inhabitants are rich in cattle and trade them for bottles of brandy or tobacco. She was not described as a person with a history, a culture, a language. She was described as an anthropological curiosity from a land where people bartered livestock for liquor. Audience members were permitted to poke at her with sticks. They were permitted to touch her. They were permitted to say, within earshot, whatever they wanted about her body. Wealthy patrons paid extra for private exhibitions in their homes, exclusive access to Sara Baartman as a dinner party spectacle. Night after night, week after week, Sara was subjected to this, the cold and the humiliation. The English winter seeping through the thin fabric of her exhibition costume, the faces of strangers who had paid for the privilege of her degradation. And somewhere in the crowd, Dunlop and Caesars counted their coins. But not everyone in London was willing to look the other way. The African Association, an abolitionist society, heard about what was happening to Sara Baartman and decided to act. The man leading the campaign was Zachary Macaulay, one of the most powerful figures in the British anti-slavery movement, co-author of the 1807 Slave Trade Act, and a founder of what would later become the University of London. If anyone had the credibility and the connections to free Sara, it was him. The case went to trial on the 24th of November, 1810, just weeks after Sara had arrived in England. The central question was simple. Was Sara Baartman being exhibited of her own free will, or was she being held and exploited against her wishes? The African Association presented compelling evidence. They described the conditions of her cage. They questioned the legitimacy of the contract. They argued, convincingly, that a woman who was illiterate and unable to read the document she had signed could not have given meaningful consent. Then Sara was brought forward to speak, and she stated clearly that she had not been sexually abused, that she had come to London of her own free will, that she was not being held against her will. The case was dismissed. Now, here is what the records don't tell you, but what every historian who has studied this case understands. William Dunlop was present in the room when Sara made that statement. Think about what that means for a moment. Sara Baartman was an illiterate Khoikhoi woman, alone in a foreign country, with no legal advocate, no translator she could trust, and no way to navigate the British legal system. The only people she knew in England were the men who were exploiting her, and those men were in the room when she spoke. What would you say in her position? What would you say if the only people who controlled your food, your shelter, your safety, your entire existence in a country where you knew no one and spoke imperfect English were standing 10 feet away watching you testify? The case was dismissed. Dunlop and Caesars walked free. But there was one small, almost accidental consequence. The public attention generated by the trial made Sara Baartman's shows more popular than ever. She travelled across Britain. She toured Ireland. In Manchester in 1814, she was baptized, given a Christian name, one more layer of identity stripped away and replaced with something her captors found more palatable. And then William Dunlop died. Sara might have thought, perhaps now things will change. She was wrong. A man named Henry Taylor saw an opportunity in Dunlop's death. Taylor had been following Sara's story for years. Word of the Hottentot Venus, the name European showmen had given Sara, a label that combined racial contempt with sexual objectification, had spread across the Channel. The French, Taylor believed, would pay well for the chance to see her. He was right. Sara arrived in Paris and was immediately swept into a world of French high society. She attended gatherings at fashionable cafes. She was presented to curious aristocrats. For a brief moment, there was almost something resembling normal social life. Then Henry Taylor sold her. She was not a person, she was an asset, and assets were sold. Sara Baartman was purchased by a man named Rowe, an animal trainer who was also, improbably, associated with comparative anatomy at the Museum of Natural History. Under Rowe, Sara's exhibition became even more explicit and degrading than anything Dunlop had subjected her to. In Paris, she was caged next to baby rhinoceroses. She was presented in a state of near nudity at every performance. There were reports, multiple independent accounts, of a collar being placed around her neck during shows. A collar around her neck, like a dog. Sara refused to be exhibited completely naked. Every time it was demanded of her, she resisted, always insisting on wearing a small garment. She clung to this final boundary with everything she had. It was the one small piece of her dignity that she refused to surrender. There was only one time she appeared fully exposed in front of an audience. Only once, and witnesses who were present noted that she knew, in that moment, exactly what was being done to her. French scientists descended on Sara with the enthusiasm of men who believed they were advancing human knowledge. The most prominent of them was Georges Cuvier, one of the most celebrated naturalists in Europe, a man whose work on comparative anatomy and extinction theory would influence science for generations. Cuvier examined Sara Baartman in clinical, degrading detail, studying her body as though she were a specimen rather than a living human being. His conclusion? Sara Baartman represented a missing link between animals and humans. She was, in his scientific opinion, proof of a racial hierarchy with European white men at the top and people like Sara somewhere considerably lower. This was not fringe pseudoscience. This was mainstream European academic thought in 1815. And Sara Baartman, alive, present, watching men write down their assessments of her as subhuman, was the evidence they used to support it. The racism embedded in these scientific conclusions would echo for over a century, influencing colonial policy, eugenics movements, and the systematic oppression of black and indigenous peoples across the world. Sara Baartman had her body used to build the intellectual architecture of white supremacy. Sara Baartman's time in Paris lasted approximately 15 months. They were 15 months of deterioration. She lived in poor conditions. She had no reliable income, despite having generated enormous profits for the men who controlled her. She was cold, hungry, and miserable in a city where she had no allies, no community, and no safe place to go. She began to drink heavily. Whether this was a choice or a symptom of profound trauma and despair is a question that her caretakers never thought to ask. Then she became pregnant. The father's identity was recorded only as a man named Elisa. The child, a son named Okuro, died when he was 5 years old, cause unknown. Another child, gone. On the 29th of December 1815, Sara Baartman died in Paris. She was 26 years old. The official cause of death was listed as inflammatory disease following a smallpox infection, but other accounts suggest she may have died from pneumonia, alcoholism, syphilis, or some combination of all of these. The uncertainty is itself a kind of indignity. That the exact cause of her death remains debated because no one in her final years thought it important enough to document carefully. She was 26. She had lived through the death of both parents, a husband, 2 children, the murder of a fiancé, years of exploitation, public humiliation, and systematic dehumanization. 26 years. But the indignity didn't end with her death. It had barely begun. Georges Cuvier obtained Sara Baartman's body from the local authorities. He dissected her. He removed and preserved multiple parts of her corpse, her skeleton, her brain, her genitals, and placed them on display at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. For the French scientific establishment, her death was simply the final chapter of a research project. Sara Baartman's preserved remains were on public display at the Musée de l'Homme until 1974. Read that again. until 1974. While the world was watching the moon landing, while civil rights movements were reshaping societies across the globe, while Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for standing up against the apartheid that Sara's exploitation had helped intellectually justify, Sara Baartman's body was on display in a Paris museum. Not as a memorial, as an exhibit. South Africa began requesting the return of Sara Baartman's remains in the 1990s. Nelson Mandela personally appealed to the French government. The request was denied again and again for years. France finally agreed to repatriate her remains in 2002, after 8 years of diplomatic negotiations. On the 9th of August 2002, Women's Day in South Africa, Sara Baartman's remains were returned to the Eastern Cape province where she had been born. She was buried in the Gamtoos River Valley. For the first time in nearly 200 years, Sara Baartman was home. We tell ourselves that the world of the 19th century was simply different, less enlightened, that we've moved past these things. But consider this. The intellectual science built on Sara Baartman's body, the racial hierarchies that Cuvier and his colleagues constructed using her as their exhibit, didn't disappear when she was buried. Those ideas formed the foundation of colonialism, apartheid, and institutional racism that shaped the entire 20th century. She was not just one woman exploited by a few cruel men. She was a person whose body was used to construct an entire ideology of dehumanization. Sara Baartman was described after her death as a highly intelligent woman. She spoke 4 languages: Khoikhoi, Dutch, French, and English. She navigated some of the most hostile environments that a black African woman could possibly face in early 19th century Europe. She refused, at every opportunity she could find, to surrender the last remnants of her dignity. And they still took everything from her: her name, her freedom, her children, her body, her bones. It took nearly 2 centuries to bring her home. Remember Sara Baartman, not as the Hottentot Venus, not as a freak show attraction, not as a scientific specimen, as a woman, as a daughter, as a mother, as a human being whose life mattered enormously, and whose treatment by the so-called civilized world should haunt every one of us who claims to believe in human dignity. If this story moved you, if it angered you or saddened you or made you think, then please subscribe to this channel. Every week, we uncover stories that history tried to bury, stories of people who deserved more, who deserve to be remembered as human beings, not curiosities. Leave a comment. Do you think the French institutions that displayed Sara's remains until 1974 owe a deeper public reckoning? Or does the fact that she was finally returned home close the chapter? Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering Sara Baartman.